fasting before the pre-sanctified liturgy. In previous posts, we briefly mentioned the concept of celebrating the liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts at its proper time in the evening, and keeping a Eucharistic fast all day until communion. Sadly, this is now very rare and even unheard of in some cases. This vesperal liturgy is routinely served early in the morning, thus actually breaking the fast on Wednesdays and Fridays of Lent. Or it is served in the evenings, but the parish priest instructs the flock to fast from noon as a matter of standard practice. Here is a typical announcement put out by one parish priest. Just a reminder about tonight. Pre-sanctified liturgy at 6 p.m. Fasting for those who plan to receive the Eucharist should begin at 12 noon. Historically, the practice of Christian fasting had two simple parts: not eating and eating. The not eating part constitutes the actual fast, and the eating part is the means by which the fast is broken. For example, by eating a piece of bread or 5 figs or some other appropriate foodstuffs. In other words, as it relates to Lenten pre-sanctified liturgies, they are purposefully designed to be celebrated following Vespers, that is to say, after 3 or 4 p.m., in order to accommodate fasting until evening, because partaking of communion breaks the fast. Paradoxically, the Church, who prides herself on her patristic heritage and quasi-monastic worldview, has all but forgotten what fasting is, and commonly transfers the very meaning of this word from the act of fasting to the act of breaking the fast. Eating bread or vegetables or shrimp and fish or even dark chocolate is now called fasting, while the remnants of actual fasting can be found only on a couple of days a year, such as Great Friday, and as a short Eucharistic fast on Sunday mornings for those receiving communion. It is generally agreed upon among all Orthodox traditions that before partaking of communion on a typical Sunday morning, the faithful are to abstain from food and drink from midnight until the fast is broken by the act of receiving communion. When it comes to the pre-sanctified liturgy, however, opinions seem to differ. Below are some of the variations sorted by jurisdiction, brief commentary, canonical context surrounding the practice, and some possible ways forward. I do not provide exact sources as I think it unnecessary, but since these are direct quotations, a curious reader could easily paste selections into a search engine and find the relevant pages. Patrick Barnes, editor of the Orthodox Christian Information Center website. Among the ascetic fathers, it was the practice on weekdays not to eat until the 9th hour of the day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This practice is still kept during the Great Lent in some monasteries and indeed among many lay people. A liturgical reminder of this is the fact that during the Great Fast, the liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts is served. It is a Vespers service, and during it, the holy mysteries are imparted to the faithful, who are therefore completely abstaining from food. They eat on that day, therefore, after Vespers. If we remember the Eucharistic significance of the fast, then we know that in preparation for receiving the holy mysteries, we fast from all foods and all drink from midnight before the liturgy, whether it be a morning or evening one, during which we partake of the mysteries. The Eucharistic fast begins at midnight. Of course, usually it ends in the morning because the Divine Liturgy is properly celebrated at the 3rd hour of the day, 9 a.m. But it is permitted that it be served at any time between dawn and midday. However, some liturgies, the Presanctified, and those on the eves of certain festivals or on Great Thursday, are appointed to be celebrated with Vespers. The fast, complete abstinence, is then broken after Vespers. Patrick is a convert from Protestantism to Orthodoxy via the Antiochian Archdiocese of North America, although this does not mean that his views are necessarily identical to the positions of the Archdiocese or the Patriarchate of Antioch, with its flock primarily in Syria, Lebanon, and a few other countries in the region. Moreover, the article quoted was not written by Patrick, but only reprinted on his website, Antiochian Archdiocese of North America. A special feature of the Liturgy of the Presanctified is that it is celebrated in the evening in connection with Vespers. The early Christians preparing to receive communion at the Liturgy of the Presanctified fasted the whole day from morning till evening. Today, complete fasting is prescribed starting from noon, so that after 12 o'clock we have nothing to eat or drink until after the evening liturgy. This source does not elaborate on why the custom of the early Christians is not applicable today, or why today fasting is prescribed from noon and not from 11 a.m. or 1 p.m. Thus far, I have been unable to locate the source of this rule, but it appears that enough bishops and priests find this position to be sensible, and by now, fasting from noon has become the default practice in many jurisdictions, if one can call this fasting. In actuality, one can have breakfast in the morning, lunch at 11:30 a.m., and supper after the liturgy. With 3 square meals, it is unclear what exactly is meant by fasting. Is it fasting from afternoon tea and biscuits? It is equally unclear why slaves who were Christians in the Roman Empire or Christian peasants in medieval Byzantium or Europe could fast all day. But present-day Americans, most of whom are not farmers, roofers, or trench diggers, cannot. Our life expectancy is double what it was in the Middle Ages, and 3/4 of us are overweight or obese, and yet we cannot abstain from only 2 meals, breakfast and lunch, for the sake of receiving Holy Communion. Moscow Patriarchate. Lest it appears that Americans are unique in their inability to skip a couple of meals, here is a quote from a popular Russian website. In antiquity, before the Liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts, people abstained from food all day. Nowadays, if the Presanctified Liturgy is served in the evening, the Eucharistic fast lasts for 6 hours. Just as is the case with the American Antiochian sources quoted above, there is no explanation for why the practice nowadays is different from that of antiquity, or what is special about the number 6. Why not 3, 7, or 12, for example? The Eucharistic fast on a typical Sunday is from midnight until approximately 11 a.m. or 11 hours, and most people fast longer since they tend to have supper a few hours before midnight. Apparently, in 1968, a group of Russian bishops serving outside Russia requested that the Russian Synod discuss the issue of people attending the Presanctified Liturgy in the evenings after work. The Russian Synod made a decision on November 28th of that year to allow such people to fast for only 6 hours before the liturgy, or approximately from noon. The minutes of the discussion seem to indicate that the decision was made based on an incorrect interpretation of the 29th canon of the Sixth Ecumenical Council. It was argued that the canon mentioned a Carthaginian tradition of eating a meal before communion once a year on Great Thursday, and thus the practice may be allowable. However, not only did the Carthaginians do this only once a year in special commemoration of the mystical supper, but the Sixth Council actually disagreed with this practice and forbade it. Here is the full text of Canon 29. A canon of the Synod of Carthage says that the holy mysteries of the altar are not to be performed but by men who are fasting, except on one day in the year on which the supper of the Lord is celebrated. At that time, on account perhaps of certain occasions in those places useful to the Church, even the Holy Fathers themselves made use of this dispensation. But since nothing leads us to abandon exact observance, we decree that the apostolic and patristic tradition shall be followed, and define that it is not right to break the fast on the fifth feria of the last week of Lent, and thus to do dishonor to the whole of Lent. Another Russian source points to a common practice of serving the vesperal liturgy in the morning and finishing the service before noon. The instructional information in the Moscovite service book, late 17th century, prescribes to begin liturgy not earlier than sunrise and not later than noon, except on fasting days when one is supposed to fast until the 9th hour, around 3 p.m., and when liturgy ought to begin later, in the afternoon, in order to end by the prescribed time of breaking the fast. However, in practice, both of these directives are no longer followed in most temples of the Russian Orthodox Church. In most temples and monasteries, liturgy on fasting days is served earlier than the prescribed time and is most often finished before noon. Once again, there is enviable consistency in offering no explanation whatsoever for why people in late 17th century fasted until 3 p.m. But today, not even monastics seem capable of skipping breakfast and lunch. Is it perhaps because they do not believe fasting to be useful or beneficial to them in any meaningful way and thus simply dispense with it? Is it that they think that the fathers and mothers of the Church who practice fasting were mistaken in their practice? Orthodox Church in America. If a liturgy is in the afternoon or evening, we should fast from midnight if possible, but we must fast completely from food and water from noon or for 6 hours, whichever is longer, before receiving Holy Communion. Generally, the minimum for fasting before receiving communion all year would be to not eat or drink before receiving communion for at least 6 hours before an afternoon liturgy or pre-sanctified liturgy. This instruction, like the ones from other jurisdictions, offers no hint as to the meaning of the number 6. Refreshingly, however, it does state that we should fast from midnight if possible. Yet, in the absence of a meaningful discussion of what makes fasting possible, or rather, what makes it impossible, it seems to me that in practice, most people tend to slide down to the minimum. Indeed, why fast from midnight when fasting from noon suffices? Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. In the case of the liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts, celebrated in the early evening, the total fast may begin in the morning after a very light Lenten meal, or at least from noon. The Presanctified was from the start an evening service, communion following Vespers to be conducted after the 9th hour, that is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The day-long fast was thus broken early in the evening. Finally, while still allowing breakfast, break fast, and lunch before communion, the Greek Church appears to do so with a degree of hesitation. Or perhaps this is just wishful thinking on my part. Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. When the pre-sanctified is celebrated in the evening, the highest ideal is to keep a strict fast the whole day, from the moment of rising from sleep. However, if the practical needs of living in the world make this impossible, the individual intending to commune in the evening may have a little to eat in the morning, but must fast strictly from at least midday in order to prepare his or her heart for the divine gifts. Practically, this is more of the same, but this statement avoids some of the pitfalls of the ones at which we have looked so far. First, the practice of fasting all day is presented not as a historical curiosity, but as an ideal for today, albeit made moot if the service is scheduled for the morning hours. Second, there is a greater focus on individual needs rather than a blanket dispensation. And third, this statement avoids the seemingly arbitrary numbers such as 6 or noon. While midday is still usually understood as around noon, it does not mean noon sharp. Indeed, why not 11:45 a.m. or 12:15 p.m.? Macedonian Orthodox Diocese of America and Canada. When communion is in the evening, as with pre-sanctified liturgies during Lent, this fast should, if possible, be extended throughout the day until after communion. For those who cannot keep this discipline, a total fast beginning at noon is sometimes prescribed. Finally, this is probably the best instruction of the ones we have examined here. The option of fasting from noon is not presented as a general rule for anyone for no apparent reason, but as an individual prescription, which is sometimes offered to those who cannot keep the discipline of fasting. Very sensible. Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA, Ecumenical Patriarchate. For pre-sanctified liturgy, fast until midday, eat fasting foods as needed after that, and abstain from all food for 4 hours prior to communion. Communion usually comes about 50 minutes into the pre-sanctified liturgy. In other words, if pre-sanctified liturgy starts at, say, 7 p.m., communion would be about 7:50 p.m. Count back 4 hours from that. Start abstaining from food around 3:50 p.m. This is the most unusual take on the Eucharistic fast. On the one hand, this statement instructs to forego breakfast, a seemingly sensible thing to do, but then, in no uncertain terms, it also instructs to start eating from midday until almost 4 p.m., and then to fast for 4 hours. I am not sure that a 4-hour break in grazing constitutes a fast. As is the case with all other such statements, there is not even an attempt to explain the significance of the sacred numerology employed. Why 4 hours? Is the number 3 not a better choice, in honor of the Trinity or some other such creative theologumanizing? Why are the Ukrainian faithful not able to fast for 6 hours like their Antiochian and OCA brethren and sistern? Either number seems perfectly arbitrary, but why the difference? Alas, we may never know. Coptic Orthodox Diocese of Los Angeles, Southern California, and Hawaii. Great Lent is an ascetical fast. The Church teaches us to fast until sunset. I did not set out to examine all traditions, but this direct and clear example from the Coptic Church seems very relevant here. Note that the instruction to fast until sunset is given not for the days when one intends to partake of communion at the pre-sanctified liturgy, but in general for all weekdays of Lent. This is important because the relationship between fasting and the timing of the liturgy is such that fasting is primary. The length of a fast is not determined by when the liturgy is celebrated. Quite the contrary, the very reason that the presanctified liturgy is served in the evening is precisely because the faithful are to fast until evening. Thus, the liturgy must be a vesperal one. These are not ancient Copts. These are not the Copts who live in Egypt, where temperatures are mild and pleasant, and where life is leisurely and free from discomforts. No, these are the Copts who live in the harsh climate and difficult conditions of Southern California and Hawaii. Whether all Copts in Hawaii do indeed fast until sunset is a question akin to whether all Greeks or Antiochians abstain from olive oil on all fasting days. Perhaps some do, and others do not. Life in Hawaii and California is very hard, and who are we to judge? But it is important that the standard is set. One should not think that it is a uniquely Coptic standard. The very same standard is set by our own Typicon in chapter 32 concerning all weeks of Great Lent, except the first week, which has special fasting rules. In other weeks, we fast until evening for 5 days and eat xerophagy, except on Saturdays and Sundays. The Typicon is not the only source of instructions about fasting. There were several important councils held in Carthage between A.D. 251 and 525. One of these councils, held in 397, gave us the canon of the books of the Bible. Another one, held in 419 and presided over by St. Aurelius of Carthage, approved 138 rules, or canons, 135 in other enumerations. Canon 41:44 reads as follows: that by men who are fasting sacrifices are to be offered to God, that the sacraments of the altar are not to be celebrated except by those who are fasting, except on the one anniversary of the celebration of the Lord's Supper, for if the commemoration of some of the dead, whether bishops or others, is to be made in the afternoon, let it be only with prayers, if those who officiate have already breakfasted. The Sixth Ecumenical Council confirmed these decisions in Canon 29, as was discussed above, but clarified that eating a meal before communion on Great Thursday had been a local Carthaginian tradition which was not to be adopted by the Church, and the standard of fasting before communion was upheld as universal and without exceptions. Canon 47:51 of the Council of Carthage. True, it is that sacrifices are to be forbidden after breakfast, so that they may be offered as is right by those who are fasting, and this has been confirmed then, that is, at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, and now. It is clear from canonical sources that the structure of Eucharistic services in the context of fasting has been established by the Church with the explicit purpose of allowing for fasting until communion, and on weekdays during Great Lent, this means until after Vespers or after 3 p.m. Attempting to change one element in this structure, whether the timing of the liturgy or of the Eucharistic fast, puts the entire system out of balance and creates nonsensical outcomes. This perhaps could be tolerable on account of a real and critical need for change, but so far I have not been able to find good and compelling arguments in favor of a general and regularized violation of the system of Lenten fasting. The usual argument seems to be that early Christians were somehow different from their present-day descendants, so much so that we are simply incapable of following in their footsteps. This argument is likely without merit. Even a casual student of history realizes that Christians living in Palestine or Byzantium or Europe 2000 or 1500 or 1000 years ago differed from us only in that they led much more difficult, physically demanding lives, full of hard labor, disease, conflict, war, and death. In the rest, those early Christians had the same psychology as we do, the same physiology, the same struggles, and the same sins. While it is true that some Christians in the past had a unique talent for strict asceticism given to them by God, this has always been the case and continues to be today. But the general rules of the Church do not propose that we subsist on meager plant roots in the Egyptian desert or eat only one meal a week for the entirety of our lives, or live exclusively on grass broth for 1,000 days and nights, as did Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Quite the contrary, the fasting rules of the Church were created for general use by all Christians. This is an overstatement, but a more detailed analysis requires a separate treatment. There are certainly some who cannot follow general rules and require dispensations due to their health or age or occupation. But such individual dispensations should not become general rules for all. Aiming for the lowest common denominator does not seem like a good strategy. The specific methods of breaking the Eucharistic fast offered by the various practices appear as indefensible as the main premise for instituting such practices. Indeed, why fast from noon? Yes, noon is approximately midday, but what of it? The natural division of days recognized by the Church for 2 millennia is at midnight, not midday. And what about the 6-hour rule, or the 4-hour one? I have been unable to find any explanation, reasonable or otherwise, for the number of hours. There is one obscure mention that the stomach must be empty before communion. I am not aware that this has ever been a concern of the Church. To the best of my knowledge, no Church Father has ever busied himself with calculating how long various foods remain in the stomach or with building vomitoria at the entrances to churches in order to evacuate stomach contents for those intending to receive communion. And why stomach only? Why not attempt to clean out the entire intestinal tract? Such impious ideas aside, the practice of either moving the vesperal liturgy to the morning hours or formalizing the breaking of the Eucharistic fast before an evening service seems like an attempt to have one's Lenten cake and eat it too, so to speak. But as the Russian saying goes, if you chase after 2 rabbits, you will not catch a single one. Thus, either the Lenten fast is dispensed with, or both the Lenten and the Eucharistic fasts are broken by eating breakfast and lunch before partaking of communion. If there really is a serious problem in need of a solution, and I am not aware of such a problem, then perhaps more rational options can be envisioned. First, if neither the priest nor his flock are able or willing to keep the Eucharistic fast, perhaps pre-sanctified liturgies need not be served. According to many commentators, the historical reasons for serving pre-sanctified liturgies is that in the past, people, specifically monks, communed several times a week, and during Lent, when liturgies are celebrated only on Saturdays and Sundays, they missed partaking of the body and blood of Christ on weekdays. This is certainly no longer the case in most, if not all, parishes. If people, including clergy, do not miss having communion midweek, why serve the pre-sanctified liturgies, and in a compromised manner at that? It is possible, of course, that by now people look forward not so much to communion, but to the service itself. In this case, it may be possible to muster enough strength and willpower and resolve to serve it properly once or twice during Lent. Why would this not be an acceptable option? Second, if an overwhelming majority of Orthodox faithful no longer observe a fast until evening during Lent and do not wish to return to this practice, perhaps it is time to decouple the pre-sanctified liturgy from Vespers and connect it to Matins instead. This would certainly eliminate the absurdity of completing our evening prayer unto the Lord at 7 o'clock in the morning. Finally, the simplest solution that can be implemented immediately and with no special approval by any synod or bishop is to serve the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts properly, and as it was intended, starting the service between 2 and 4 p.m. and keeping the Eucharistic fast from midnight until communion. Perhaps not all will be able to commune. Perhaps some will require individual dispensations. This has always been practiced in the Church. But neither the inability of some to attend or commune, nor the need of others for individual dispensations has ever affected our service of the Divine Liturgy. Why should these considerations alter the way we serve pre-sanctified liturgies or the way we fast? If there is anyone who keeps the practice of fasting until evening in a parish that schedules pre-sanctified liturgies for the morning, will this not deprive this person of his ability to fast on account of those who choose not to? To be sure, the current course of almost all Orthodox churches is set as is described in the discussed quotations and is unlikely to change any time soon. Perhaps not in our lifetime, but it did change at some point in the past and may change again in the future. If more faithful are at least aware of the issues discussed here, there is hope that the future change will be toward the tradition of the Church and common sense, not away from them. It did not take long for the Roman Catholic Church to shrink her Eucharistic fast to just 1 hour, and the Lenten fast to lobster instead of steak on Fridays. The Orthodox Church is usually slower to change, but given the current trends and strange popular ideas that we in the West are so much weaker and our lives are so much more difficult than those of Christians in the Roman Empire, it may be only a matter of time before we begin our slide toward shallowness and nominality of our asceticism. Returning to traditional Christian asceticism may be a losing battle, but I think it is well worth fighting for. Share Phroneo. This is a reader-supported publication. If you enjoyed this post, please share it with your friends. This will help a lot.